The morning sun cast long shadows across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor as Seaman First Class James Mitchell adjusted his cap and began his routine inspection of the USS Arizona. It was Sunday, December 7, 1941, and the Hawaiian morning felt like any other peaceful weekend at the naval base. The gentle trade winds carried the scent of plumeria blossoms from the nearby shores, mixing with the familiar smell of salt water and diesel fuel that permeated the harbor. Mitchell had no way of knowing that 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were cutting through the Pacific swells just 200 miles north of Oahu, their flight decks alive with the purposeful movement of pilots and ground crews preparing for what would become one of the most devastating surprise attacks in military history. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, his weathered face betraying none of the tension that gripped his heart as he watched the final preparations unfold. At Ford Island, in the center of Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was enjoying a leisurely breakfast in the officers' mess. The base was operating on a reduced Sunday schedule, with many sailors either attending church services or sleeping in after Saturday night's shore leave. Battleship Row presented an impressive sight, with 8 massive warships moored in pairs along the southeast shore of Ford Island. The USS Arizona and USS Vestal lay side by side, while the USS Oklahoma was berthed alongside the USS Maryland. According to historical records from the National Archives, the Pacific Fleet had been moved to Pearl Harbor in 1940 as a deterrent to Japanese expansion in the Pacific. What Admiral Husband Kimmel and his staff didn't realize was that this concentration of naval power had made them an irresistible target for Japanese military planners who had been secretly developing their attack strategy for months. The Japanese strike force had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the remote Kuril Islands on November 26th, maintaining strict radio silence as they sailed eastward through the North Pacific. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the first wave of attacking aircraft, had spent countless hours studying reconnaissance photographs of Pearl Harbor, memorizing every detail of the harbor's layout and the typical positioning of American warships. Back at Pearl Harbor, the morning routine continued undisturbed. Mess halls filled with the aroma of bacon and coffee as sailors gathered for breakfast. On the USS West Virginia, Ensign Victor Delano was reviewing duty rosters with his petty officers, planning the day's maintenance schedule. The ship's band was preparing for a concert that afternoon, their instruments polished and ready in the ship's recreation area. The radar station at Opana Point on Oahu's north shore was operating with a skeleton crew, as most of the experienced operators had the day off. Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott were maintaining the morning watch, their screens displaying the familiar patterns of commercial air traffic and the occasional military flight. At 07:02 hours, they detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north, but their report to the information center was dismissed as either a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from California or a routine patrol. As the clock approached 7:30, the first wave of Japanese aircraft began their descent toward their targets, their engines humming with deadly purpose as they approached the sleeping naval base that would soon become a symbol of American resolve. At exactly 7:48 on that fateful Sunday morning, the tranquil silence of Pearl Harbor was shattered by the roar of diving aircraft and the thunder of exploding bombs. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first wave of 49 Nakajima B-5 and Kate bombers, transmitted the code words Tora, Tora, Tora back to the Japanese fleet, confirming that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Seaman Mitchell, who had been securing lines on the Arizona's deck, looked up in confusion as the first bombs fell on Ford Island. The sight that greeted him seemed impossible. Aircraft with the rising sun emblem of Japan diving toward the harbor like mechanical birds of prey. The distinctive sound of their engines, different from any American aircraft, filled the air with an ominous drone that would haunt survivors for decades to come. The first target was the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, where rows of American aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip in neat formations, grouped together for easier maintenance and security, a peacetime arrangement that now proved catastrophic. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their bombs destroying dozens of aircraft before they could even be started. Within minutes, the base's ability to mount any significant air defense was eliminated. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey, who had been finishing his breakfast, rushed outside as the first explosions rocked the island. His training kicked in immediately, and he became one of the first American officers to recognize the attack for what it was. He rushed to the radio room and transmitted the message that would alert the world. AIR raid Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill. The message, sent at 7:58, marked the moment when America's peaceful Sunday morning transformed into a day of infamy. On Battleship Row, the scene was one of coordinated devastation. The Japanese had studied American naval procedures meticulously, and they knew that the massive warships would be moored in predictable patterns with reduced crews on Sunday mornings. The USS Oklahoma, anchored outboard of the USS Maryland, took the first torpedo hits. The specially modified aerial torpedoes, equipped with wooden fins to operate in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, slammed into the Oklahoma's port side with thunderous explosions that lifted the massive ship in the water. According to declassified military reports from the Pearl Harbor History Associates, the attack involved 183 aircraft. In the first wave, including 43 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 49 Kate bombers, 51 Val dive bombers, and 40 Kate bombers configured as torpedo planes. This coordinated assault represented months of planning and training, with Japanese pilots practicing their runs over mock-ups of Pearl Harbor constructed in Japan. Aboard the USS Arizona, Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg was rushing to the bridge when a Kate bomber flying at low altitude released its payload directly over the ship's forward magazines. The subsequent explosion was so massive that it lifted the Arizona's forward section completely out of the water before slamming it back down in a twisted mass of steel. The blast killed 1,177 sailors and Marines instantly, including Captain Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, making it the single deadliest moment in the attack. The USS West Virginia, where Ensign Delano had been reviewing duty schedules just minutes before, took 7 torpedo hits in rapid succession. The ship began listing heavily to port, and only the quick thinking of Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, who ordered counter-flooding of the starboard compartments, prevented the battleship from capsizing like the Oklahoma. Captain Mervyn Bennion, mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb hit on the nearby USS Tennessee, continued to direct damage control efforts until his death. As the first wave continued its deadly work, American servicemen throughout the harbor began to respond with whatever weapons they could find. Sailors ran to man anti-aircraft guns that had been secured for the weekend, breaking locks and ignoring safety protocols in their desperate attempt to fight back. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived at 8:54, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, with 81 dive bombers, 54 high-level bombers, and 36 fighters. By this time, the initial shock had worn off, and American defenders were mounting an increasingly fierce resistance. The sky above Pearl Harbor became a deadly arena, where courage and desperation collided with devastating results. Petty Officer First Class John Finn, stationed at Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay, had been wounded in the initial attack but refused to abandon his post. Despite taking shrapnel in his chest and arms, Finn continued to operate a .50 caliber machine gun from an exposed position, shooting down several enemy aircraft while under continuous fire. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, making him one of 15 Pearl Harbor defenders to receive the nation's highest military decoration. At the Naval Air Station on Ford Island, Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John Finn's counterpart, Chief Petty Officer Robert Scott, was performing equally heroic actions. Scott had been knocked unconscious by the first wave of attacks, but awakened to find his hangar in flames and aircraft destroyed all around him. Ignoring his injuries, he organized a team of sailors to rescue wounded comrades from burning aircraft and buildings, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire and the danger of exploding ammunition. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, became a symbol of American fighting spirit. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, the senior officer aboard, made the decision to sortie from the harbor despite the ongoing attack. As the Nevada began moving toward the harbor entrance, she drew the concentrated attention of Japanese dive bombers who recognized the danger of allowing any major warship to escape. The ship took several direct hits but continued her journey, black smoke pouring from her superstructure as her crew fought fires while maintaining course. Ensign Joe Taussig Jr., aboard the Nevada, was severely wounded when a bomb exploded near his battle station, but he refused medical attention and continued to direct his gun crew. His father, Rear Admiral Joseph Taussig, had served in the Navy for over 30 years, and the younger Taussig was determined to uphold the family tradition of naval service. Despite losing his leg in the attack, he would later return to active duty and continue serving his country. As documented in the official Navy Department communique released on December 8, 1941, the heroism displayed by individual sailors and Marines was matched by the collective courage of entire crews. On the capsizing USS Oklahoma, sailors trapped below decks worked frantically to free their shipmates, many sacrificing their own chances of escape to help others reach safety. 32 sailors were eventually rescued from the overturned hull, pulled through holes cut by Navy divers working around the clock. The USS Arizona, now a blazing inferno with her forward magazines destroyed, became the focus of desperate rescue efforts. Motor Launch 479, commanded by Ensign Douglas Hine, repeatedly approached the burning battleship to evacuate survivors despite the intense heat and the danger of secondary explosions. Hine and his crew saved dozens of men from the oil-covered water, their small boat making trip after trip through the floating debris and flames. On Hospital Point, Navy medical personnel worked under fire to treat the wounded streaming in from damaged ships and installations. Lieutenant Ruth Erickson, one of the Navy nurses on duty, later described the scene as organized chaos, with medical staff performing triage under the most difficult conditions imaginable. The hospital's windows had been blown out by the concussion from nearby explosions, but the medical team continued their work without interruption. The civilian population of Honolulu also demonstrated remarkable courage during the attack. Despite the danger from falling anti-aircraft shells and the possibility of enemy invasion, civilian doctors and nurses rushed to military hospitals to assist with the wounded. Radio station KGMB continued broadcasting throughout the attack, providing crucial information to both military personnel and civilians while risking their own safety by maintaining their transmissions. By 9:30 in the morning, the second wave of Japanese attackers was completing its deadly mission, but the American response had grown significantly more effective. Anti-aircraft batteries throughout Oahu were now fully manned and firing with increasing accuracy. The sky above the harbor was filled with black puffs of exploding shells, and several Japanese aircraft had been shot down by the intensifying defensive fire. Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, two Army Air Forces pilots, who had been attending an all-night party at Wheeler Field, managed to reach their P-40 Warhawk fighters at Halewa Field during the height of the attack. Despite the chaos and the fact that their aircraft were not loaded with ammunition, they took off and engaged the Japanese formations. Welch shot down 4 enemy aircraft and Taylor downed 2, becoming the only American pilots to achieve multiple kills during the attack. The harbor itself had become a hellscape of burning oil, twisted metal, and desperate rescue efforts. The USS California, hit by 2 torpedoes early in the attack, was slowly settling by the stern as her crew fought a losing battle against the flooding. Captain Joel Bunkley had ordered abandoned ship, but many sailors remained aboard to fight fires and assist in rescue operations. The ship's executive officer, Commander Earl Stone, coordinated the evacuation of wounded personnel, while ensuring that classified materials were secured or destroyed. Dory Miller, a cook aboard the USS West Virginia, had been collecting laundry when the attack began. When his battle station in the ship's communications area was destroyed by torpedo damage, Miller helped move the mortally wounded Captain Mervyn Bennion to safety. He then manned a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to operate, and continued firing at Japanese aircraft until ordered to abandon his position. Miller's actions made him the first African American to receive the Navy Cross, though racial segregation policies of the time initially prevented proper recognition of his heroism. The Japanese commanders, monitoring the attack from their carriers, were pleased with the results but increasingly concerned about American air defenses. Several of their most experienced pilots had been shot down, and the anti-aircraft fire was becoming more accurate with each passing minute. Commander Fuchida, circling overhead in his Kate bomber, assessed the damage and concluded that the primary objectives had been achieved. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled, at least temporarily. According to historical analysis from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the attack's success was due in large part to meticulous planning and the element of complete surprise. However, several factors worked in favor of the Americans during the battle itself. The harbor's relatively shallow depth meant that many ships could be raised and repaired, and the fact that the attack occurred on a Sunday morning meant that many off-duty personnel were ashore, reducing casualties on the ships. The USS Shaw, in dry dock for maintenance, became one of the most photographed moments of the attack when her forward magazine exploded in a massive fireball that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Despite the spectacular nature of the explosion, the ship's crew had largely evacuated, and she would eventually be repaired and returned to service. The iconic image of the Shaw's explosion would become one of the most enduring visual symbols of Pearl Harbor. As the second wave of attackers began withdrawing toward their carriers, the extent of the damage became apparent. 18 warships had been sunk or severely damaged, including 8 battleships that represented the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. The human cost was even more devastating. 2,403 Americans had been killed, and 1,178 wounded. The majority of casualties occurred aboard the Arizona and Oklahoma, where hundreds of sailors remained trapped in the overturned and burning hulks. However, the attack had also failed to achieve several crucial objectives that would prove significant in the coming war. The Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were all at sea during the attack and escaped damage. The harbor's fuel storage facilities, crucial for any sustained naval operations, were untouched, as were the submarine base and the Navy's intelligence facilities, which would play vital roles in the coming Pacific campaign. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon at approximately 10:30 in the morning, Pearl Harbor fell into an eerie silence broken only by the crackling of fires, the hiss of steam from damaged ships, and the shouts of rescue workers. The scale of the destruction was immediately apparent, but the full implications of the attack would take days to assess completely. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the deck of his flagship surveying the devastation with a mixture of shock and determination. The sight before him was almost incomprehensible. Battleship Row, once the symbol of American naval power in the Pacific, was now a graveyard of twisted steel and burning oil. The USS Oklahoma lay completely capsized, her hull rising from the water like the back of a beached whale, while the Arizona continued to burn with an intensity that would persist for days. Immediate priorities focused on rescue and damage control operations. The harbor master's office, working with tugboats and small craft, began the dangerous task of fighting fires and rescuing survivors from the water and damaged ships. The oil fires burning on the water's surface created additional hazards as rescue boats had to navigate through flames to reach stranded sailors. Many survivors were coated in thick bunker fuel oil, making them difficult to pull from the water and requiring immediate medical attention for oil ingestion and burns. Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen, the Army's senior medical officer on Oahu, coordinated the largest mass casualty event in Hawaiian history. Tripler Army Hospital, the main military medical facility on the island, had been designed to handle routine peacetime injuries, not the massive trauma cases now streaming in from the harbor. Civilian hospitals throughout Honolulu were pressed into service, and medical personnel worked around the clock performing emergency surgery and treating burns, wounds, and shock victims. The psychological impact of the attack was as significant as the physical damage. For the first time since the War of 1812, the United States mainland had been directly threatened by a foreign power, and the isolation that had characterized American strategic thinking for over a century was shattered in a single morning. News of the attack, transmitted by radio to the mainland, created panic in West Coast cities where residents feared imminent invasion. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, informed of the attack while having lunch at the White House, immediately began preparing for what he knew would be a transformative moment in American history. His famous Day of Infamy speech, delivered to Congress on December 8th, would formally bring the United States into World War II, but the real work of response began immediately after the attack ended. General Walter Short, the Army commander, responsible for Hawaiian defense, found himself coordinating with Admiral Kimmel to assess the island's vulnerability to follow-up attacks or invasion. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese strike force might return, and both commanders were acutely aware that their remaining defensive capabilities were severely compromised. Emergency measures were implemented throughout the island, including blackout procedures, martial law, and the mobilization of all available military personnel. The Japanese attack force, meanwhile, was withdrawing toward Japan with mixed feelings about their success. While they had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted massive damage, several senior officers, including Admiral Nagumo, were concerned about the long-term strategic implications of the attack. Commander Fuchida, who had led the air attacks, later wrote that he sensed the Japanese had awakened a sleeping giant, though this prescient observation would not be fully appreciated until much later. According to wartime intelligence reports, later declassified by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Japanese had considered launching a third wave of attacks against Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair installations. However, concerns about American defensive capabilities and the need to preserve their carrier force for future operations led to the decision to withdraw. This decision would prove strategically significant, as the undamaged fuel storage and repair facilities would enable the rapid restoration of American naval capabilities in the Pacific. The immediate aftermath also saw the beginning of what would become a controversial chapter in American history: the treatment of Japanese Americans living in Hawaii and on the West Coast. While the attack created understandable suspicion and fear, the mass internment of American citizens of Japanese ancestry represented one of the most troubling domestic consequences of Pearl Harbor. In Hawaii, however, the large Japanese American population was deemed too essential to the local economy for mass internment, and many individuals of Japanese ancestry would go on to serve with distinction in the American military. The sun set on December 7, 1941, over a Pearl Harbor transformed beyond recognition. Where that morning had begun with the peaceful routine of a naval base at rest, the evening found a harbor filled with sunken ships, burning oil, and the grim work of recovery operations that would continue for months. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but its consequences would reshape the world for generations to come. In the days following the attack, the true extent of American losses became clear. Beyond the immediate military casualties, the psychological impact on the American public was profound. The attack had ended the great debate between isolationists and interventionists that had divided the country since the war began in Europe in 1939. Within hours of Roosevelt's address to Congress, the United States was formally at war not only with Japan but, following Germany and Italy's declarations of war, with the Axis powers globally. The recovery operations at Pearl Harbor became a symbol of American resilience and determination. The massive salvage effort, led by Captain Homer Wallen, would eventually raise and repair all but 3 of the ships damaged in the attack. The USS Arizona, too badly damaged to salvage, became a war grave and eventually a memorial. But the USS Nevada, which had so heroically attempted to sortie during the attack, was raised, repaired, and went on to participate in the D-Day landings at Normandy. The USS West Virginia, completely sunk during the attack, was refloated and returned to action in time to participate in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944. The human stories of Pearl Harbor continued long after the attack itself. Dory Miller, the African-American cook who had manned an anti-aircraft gun aboard the West Virginia, became a symbol of courage that transcended racial barriers, though he would be killed in action 2 years later aboard the USS Liscum Bay. Lieutenant George Welch, one of the few pilots to successfully engage the Japanese attackers, survived the war and went on to become a test pilot, eventually flying experimental aircraft that would contribute to America's space program. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military impact. The attack convinced American leaders that isolationism was no longer viable in an interconnected world, leading to the creation of a permanent national security establishment that would shape American foreign policy throughout the Cold War and beyond. The intelligence failures that enabled the surprise attack led to fundamental reforms in how America gathered and analyzed information about potential threats, ultimately contributing to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. The technological lessons of Pearl Harbor also proved significant in the conduct of the war. The effectiveness of carrier-based aviation in the attack confirmed the ascendancy of aircraft carriers over battleships as the primary instruments of naval warfare. This lesson would be applied immediately in the American response, as the surviving carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga became the foundation of the Pacific Fleet's counteroffensive. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942, launched from the carrier Hornet, demonstrated that Japan itself was vulnerable to attack and provided important psychological retaliation for Pearl Harbor. Perhaps most significantly, Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of America's emergence as a global superpower. The massive industrial mobilization required to fight a two-front war transformed the American economy and society, ending the Great Depression and establishing the United States as the world's dominant economic force. The technologies developed during the war, radar, sonar, jet engines, computers, and ultimately nuclear weapons, would define the post-war world and America's place in it. The memory of Pearl Harbor became embedded in American consciousness as a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry throughout the war, and the lessons of that Sunday morning continued to influence American strategic thinking long after the war ended. The attack demonstrated that geographic isolation could not protect America from determined enemies, a lesson that would prove crucial during the Cold War, when nuclear weapons made surprise attacks even more potentially devastating. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor receives over 2 million visitors annually, serving as both a grave marker for the 1,177 sailors and Marines who remain entombed in the ship and a reminder of the day that changed history forever. The memorial stands as testament to the courage of those who served, the resilience of the American spirit, and the enduring importance of remembering the lessons of history. December 7th, 1941, remains a date that will live in infamy, but also as a day that revealed the best of American character in the face of unprecedented challenge.